Battle of Buxar, its causes and consequences. The Battle of Buxar was the decisive battle which defined British as a ruler that was fought between English forces and combined army of Mir Qasim, the Nawab of Bengal, Nawab of Oudh and Shah Alam II, Mughal emperor. The battle was the outcome of misuse of Farman and Dastak, and also the trade expansionist aspiration of English. On the 22nd of October 1764, the Battle of Buxar took place and the Indian armies were defeated. The Battle of Buxar proved itself to be a turning point in the history of India. In 1765, Shuja-ud-Dawla and Shah Alam signed treaties at Allahabad with Clive, who had become the governor of the company. Under these treaties, the English company secured the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar and Odisha, which gave the company the right to collect revenue from these territories. The Nawab of Awadh ceded Allahabad and Kora to the Mughal emperor, who began to reside at Allahabad under the protection of the British troops. The company agreed to pay rupees 26 lakhs every year to the Mughal emperor, but they stopped making this payment soon after. The company promised to send its troops to defend the Nawab against any invaders, for which the Nawab would be required to pay. Thus, the Nawab of Awadh became dependent on the company. In the meantime, Mir Jafar had again been made the Nawab of Bengal. After his death, his son was installed as the Nawab. The officials of the company made huge personal profits by extorting money from the Nawab. Events leading to the battlefield. Misuse of Farman and Dastak by British, which challenged the Mir Qasim's authority and sovereignty. Abolition of all duties on internal trade of British. Misbehavior of the company's servant. They compelled the Indian artisans, peasants and merchant to sell their goods at cheap price, and also started the tradition of bribes and gifts. Plundering attitude of British, which not only abuses the trade ethics but also challenges the Nawab authority. Conclusion. The Battle of Buxar proved itself to be a turning point in the history of India. The interest of British was concentrated in the three coastal areas, namely Calcutta, Bombay and Madras. The Anglo-French wars in Carnatic and the battles of Plassey and Buxar began the period of British conquest of India. By 1765, the British had become the virtual rulers of Bengal, Bihar and Odisha. The Nawab of Awadh had become dependent on them, and so was the Nawab of Carnatic, who was their creation. Key points on subsidiary alliance. Subsidiary alliance features. The British East India Company started an outright war of non-intervention policy and the assumption of the territories of previously subordinated rulers to achieve political aspiration, i.e. bringing the Indian states within the orbit of British power. The subsidiary alliance system was non-intervention policy used by Lord Wellesley, who was the Governor-General, 1798 to 1805, to establish the British Empire in India. According to this system, every ruler in India had to accept to pay a subsidy to the British for the maintenance of the British army. In return, the British would protect them from their enemies, which gave the British enormous expansion. The term subsidiary alliance was introduced by French Governor Duplessis and was firstly used by Lord Wellesley, who effectively institutionalized the policy of non-intervention, which made the Nawab and Nizam subsidiary allies by signing almost 100 such treaties. Key points of the subsidiary alliance. 1. The allies of the Indian states' rulers were compelled to accept the permanent garrison of the British army within their territories and to pay a subsidy for its maintenance. 2. The Indian ruler could not employ any European in their service without prior approval of the British. 3. They could not negotiate with any other Indian rulers without consulting the Governor-General. 4. A British resident was also stationed in the Indian court. State comes under the periphery of the policy. 1. The Nizam of Hyderabad was the first victim of this policy. In AD 1798 it detached the Nizam from the French and also forbade having alliances with Maratha without British consent. 2. Second state was Mysore in AD 1799. Then Wellesley compelled the Nawab of Awadh to accept the policy of subsidiary alliance in AD 1801. 3. In AD 1802, Peshwa Baji II also subjugated his state under this policy. Many Maratha states like Bhosle and Scindia in AD 1803 also accepted the terms of the policy. 4. The last Maratha Confederation, i.e. Holkars II, accepted the terms of the subsidiary alliance. The policy of subsidiary alliance was in reality a document of losing sovereignty, which meant the state did not have the rights of self-defense, of maintaining diplomatic relations, of employing foreign experts, and of settling its disputes with its neighbors. Doctrine of lapse, meaning, objective and its impact. Doctrine of lapse was the pro-imperialist approach to expand the realm of British Kingdom in India. It was introduced by Dalhousie, who was the Governor-General. It was used by him to annex the independent Indian states. It was basically an idea to annex those states which have no heir, means state have no heir, they get lapsed the right of ruling and it will not reverted by adoption. Before AD 1818, East India Company was acted as mere trader, not as sovereign ruler, but after it they came with the ambition to control and rule the entire region of Indian state that was started with subsidiary alliance and now with doctrine of lapse. These policies were adopted to control all the authority of state and make it British Dominion state. The main complication was started with those Indian state have no heir, and according to the policy, the state have lost their ruling rights because of no heir. States were annexed by Dalhousie by applying doctrine of lapse. 1. The States of Satara, 1848 AD, 2. Jaipur, 1849 AD, 3. Sambalpur, 1849 AD, 4. Bahut, 1858 5. Udaipur, 1852 AD, 6. Jhansi, 1853 AD, 7. Nagpur, 1854 AD. But after some time, the terms of policy would get great aggression, and it was Surendra Sai, the great revolutionary of Orissa, who raised voice against the doctrine of lapse. That aggression created the foundation of revolt. Key points of doctrine of lapse. 1. Policy to expand British territory in India on basis of pro-imperialistic approach. 2. State must be handed over to British, if they have no heir or ruler. 3. Adoptions of child were not accepted for heir. 4. Policy was not in support to give title and pension to adopted child of rulers. 5. Adopted heir would inherit only the personal property of the ruler. 6. Ended the title and pension. Hence, British came to India for the purpose of trade, but their ambition of monopolizing the resources drives them to become mighty in India. The doctrine of lapse was basically expansionist policy of British East India Company to increase the real of British Empire by annexing the other state in India by hook or crook. This was introduced by Dalhousie to enable the British East India Company to monopolize their dominion over India state, which increased their revenue. This made the British very unpopular and the rulers of the different states as bitter enemies of the British, which become one of the reasons of 1857 revolt. The Regulating Act, 1773, key features. The chaotic situation brought about by the misgovernment of Bengal forced the British Parliament to inquire into the affairs of the East India Company. This revealed gross malpractices of the senior officials of the company. The company was also facing a financial crisis at this time and had applied to the British government for a loan of £1 million. The British Parliament found it necessary to regulate the activities of the company in India, and for this, the Regulating Act of 1773 was passed. This was the first direct interference made by the British government in the affairs of India. Its purpose was to take a step towards removing the political power from the hands of a trading company. The Act also provided specific measures to set up a new administrative framework. The president of the company's Calcutta factory, who used to be the governor of Bengal, was made the governor-general of all the Indian territories of the company. The other two governors of Bombay and Madras were made subordinate to him. He was to have a council of 4 members. For the administration of justice, the Act proposed the setting up of a Supreme Court at Calcutta. The defects of the Regulating Act became clear very soon. There were constant quarrels between Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General, and the members of his council. List of acts after 1857 during British India. The Supreme Court also could not function smoothly as its jurisdiction and its relations with the council were not clear. It was also not clear which law, Indian or English, was to follow. This court had sentenced to death an ex-Dewan of Murshidabad, Maharajananda Kumar, and a Brahmin by caste, which was charged with committing forgery. But in India a Brahmin could not be sentenced to death for such an offence. This matter created much sensation in Bengal. Moreover, the control of the British government over the company remained vague even after the enactment of the Regulating Act. Key features of the Regulating Act of 1773. 1. It designated the Governor-General of Bengal and created an executive council of 4 members to assist him. Lord Warren Hastings was the first Governor-General of Bengal. 2. Governors of Bombay and Madras presidencies subordinate to the Governor-General of Bengal. 3. It provided for the establishment of a Supreme Court at Calcutta, 1774, with 1 Chief Justice and 3 other judges. 4. It prohibited the servants of the company from engaging in any private trade or accepting presents or bribes from the natives. Key features of Pitt's India Act of 1784. To remove the drawbacks of the Regulating Act and to make the administration of the company's Indian territories efficient and responsible, a series of inquiries were made and measures were taken by the British Parliament during the next decade. Of these, the most important one was the Pitt's India Act of 1784, named after William Pitt, the younger Prime Minister of Britain at that time. This act set up a board of control in Britain through which the British government could fully control the company's civil, military, and revenue affairs in India. The company, however, continued to have the monopoly of trade and the right to appoint and dismiss its own officials. Thus a system of dual government of British India by the British government and the company was set up. Governor-General was given the power to overrule his council on important matters. Presidencies of Bombay and Madras were brought under his authority, and he was made the commander-in-chief of all the British troops in India, both of the company and of the British government. The principles laid down by the Act of 1784 formed the base of the British administration in India. The agencies through which the Governor-General exercised his power and responsibility were the army, the police, the civil service and the judiciary. The Indian sepoys formed the bulk of the company's army. Its size grew along with the British expansion. By the time the conquest of India was completed, the number of sepoys had risen to about 200,000. They were regularly paid and thoroughly trained in the use of the latest arms. The soldiers engaged by the Indian rulers did not usually have these facilities. Moreover, one success after another had won the company's army considerable amount of prestige, which attracted many recruits to it. But all the officers of this army were Europeans. Besides the company's army, British troops were also stationed in India. Though the company's Indian soldiers earned the reputation of being very efficient, they were just mercenary soldiers of a colonial power. They did not have the pride that enthused the soldiers of a national army, nor were there many avenues of promotion open to them. These factors sometimes provoked them to revolt. The greatest of these revolts took place in 1857. One of the provisions of the Pitt's India Act forbade the policy of conquest. But this provision was seldom observed. Fresh conquests were necessary to serve the economic interests of Britain, i.e. wider market for the finished goods coming out of factories and finding new sources for collecting raw materials. Establishing law and order in the conquered territories as early as possible was also necessary for this purpose. So a regular police force had to be organized for maintaining law and order. During the time of Lord Cornwallis, this force was given a regular shape. In 1791, a superintendent of police for Calcutta was appointed, and soon other cities were placed in the charge of Kotwals. The districts were divided into thanas, each of which was put under the charge of a daroga. The hereditary village policemen became chowkidars. Later the post of a district superintendent of police was created. Though the police played a vital role in maintaining law and order, it never became popular. It earned much notoriety for its corruption and harassment of common people. Though it became the symbol of the government authority all over the country, its lower ranks were very poorly paid. As in the army, here also, only the Europeans were eligible for higher posts. Conclusion. Hence, the Acts contain very important significance that British government has been given the supreme control over companies' affairs and its administration. It was the first when companies' possessions called British possession. Charter Act of 1793, importance and its key features. Charter Act, 1793 AD provisionalised the company's trade monopoly with India. The realm of governance of Governor-General increased over the governors of Bombay and Madras. The Supreme Court's jurisdiction was increased to the high seas. They can appoint the members of the civil services as justices of the peace, scavengers for the presidency towns, and can ban on the sale of liquor without license. Features of the Act. 1. Act provided the exclusive trade privileges and renewed 20 years. 2. The realm of governance of Governor-General increased over the governors of Bombay and Madras. 3. A regular code of all regulations that could be enacted for the internal government of British territory in Bengal was framed. The regulation was applied to the rights, persons, and property of the Indian people and bounded the courts to regulate their decisions by the code itself. This act was made only fairly minimal changes to either the system of government in India or British oversight of the company's activities. Most importantly, the company's trade monopoly was continued for a further 20 years. Salaries for the staff and paid members of the Board of Control were also now charged to the company. Features of the Charter Act of 1813. The operation of continental system had caused marked decline in the British trade due to the long continuation of Napoleonic War. The British merchants persistently demanded that company trade should be open to all private traders, so in order to meet their demand the Charter Act was passed. It is also known as the East India Company's Act of 1813, was an act that continued the British East India Company's rule in India by the Parliament of Britain. Features and provisions of the Act. 1. This asserted the Crown's sovereignty over British India by defining the constitutional position of British in India. 2. This Act also empowered the local governments to impose taxes on the persons subject to the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. 3. The European British subjects was also strengthened in India over the power of the provincial governments and courts. 4. Financial provision was made to encourage a revival in Indian literature and for the promotion of science. 5. This Act also envisages that missionaries can go and spread the Christianity in India. History of Modern India, a complete study material. Main features of the Charter Act of 1833. Charter Act of 1833 was the outcome of industrial revolution in England, which envisages that Indians had to function as market for the English mass production on the basis of laissez-faire. Thus the Charter Act of 1833 was institutionalised on basis of liberal concept. This was an act of the Parliament of the United Kingdom that gave East India Company to rule India for another 20 years. The act legalised the British colonisation of India and the territorial possessions of the company, but were held in trust for His Majesty for the service of Government of India. Features of Charter Act. 1. It made the Governor-General of Bengal as the Governor-General of India and vested in him all civil and military powers. Thus, the Act created, for the first time, a Government of India having authority over the entire territorial area possessed by the British in India. Lord William Bentinck was the first Governor-General of India. 2. It deprived the Governor of Bombay and Madras of their legislative powers. The Governor-General of India was given exclusive legislative powers for the entire British India. The laws made under the previous acts were called as regulations, while laws made under this act were called as acts. 3. It ended the activities of the East India Company as a commercial body, which became a purely administrative body. It provided that the company's territories in India were held by it in trust for His Majesty, his heirs, and successors. 4. This act attempted to introduce a system of open competition for selection of civil servants, and stated that the Indians should not be debarred from holding any place, office, and employment under the company. However, this provision was negated after opposition from the Court of Directors. This act allowed wider space to the British in the India's administration. It ended the British India Company's commercial activities and transformed into the British Crown's trustee in administering India. Charter Act of 1853, main features. The Charter Act of 1853 empowered the British East India Company to retain the territories and the revenues in India in trust for the Crown, not for any specified period as preceding Charter Acts had provided, but only until Parliament should otherwise direct. This was framed on the basis of reports made by the Select Committees of Inquiry in 1852. Raja Ram Roy Mohan Roy England visit and petitions of Bombay Association and Madras Native Association. These two events resulted into the Charter Act of 1853. Features of the Act. 1. It separated, for the first time, the legislative and executive functions of the Governor-General's Council. It provided for addition of 6 new members called Legislative Councillors to the Council. In other words, it established a separate Governor-General's Legislative Council which came to be known as the Indian, Central, Legislative Council. This legislative wing of the Council functioned as a mini-parliament, adopting the same procedures as the British Parliament. Thus, legislation, for the first time, was treated as a special function of the government, requiring special machinery and special process. 2. It introduced an open competition system of selection and recruitment of civil servants. The covenanted civil service was thus thrown open to the Indians also. Accordingly, the Macaulay Committee, the Committee on the Indian Civil Service, was appointed in 1854. 3. It extended the company's rule and allowed it to retain the possession of Indian territories on trust for the British Crown. But, it did not specify any particular period, unlike the previous charters. This was a clear indication that the company's rule could be terminated at any time the Parliament liked. 4. It introduced, for the first time, local representation in the Indian, Central, Legislative Council. Of the 6 new legislative members of the Governor-General's Council, 4 members were appointed by the local, provincial, governments of Madras, Bombay, Bengal and Agra. Government of India Act, 1858, key features. In August 1858, the British Parliament passed an act that set an end to the rule of the company. The control of the British government in India was transferred to the British Crown. At this time, Victoria was the Queen of Britain. The supreme body in Britain was the British Parliament, to which the British government was responsible. All activities of the British government were, however, carried out in the name of the monarch. A minister of the British government, called the Secretary of State, was made responsible for the government of India. As the British government was responsible to Parliament, the supreme body for India also was the British Parliament. The British Governor-General of India was now also given the title of Viceroy, which means the representative of the monarch. Features of Act. 1. It provided that India henceforth was to be governed by, and in the name of, Her Majesty. It changed the designation of the Governor-General of India to that of Viceroy of India. He, Viceroy, was the direct representative of the British Crown in India. Lord Canning thus became the first Viceroy of India. 2. It ended the system of double government by abolishing the Board of Control and Court of Directors. 3. It created a new office, Secretary of State for India, vested with complete authority and control over Indian administration. The Secretary of State was a member of the British Cabinet and was responsible ultimately to the British Parliament. 4. It established a 15-member Council of India to assist the Secretary of State for India. The council was an advisory body. The Secretary of State was made the chairman of the council. 5. It constituted the Secretary of State in Council as a body corporate, capable of suing and being sued in India and in England. The Act of 1858 was, however, largely confined to the improvement of the administrative machinery by which the Indian government was to be supervised and controlled in England. It did not alter in any substantial way the system of government that prevailed in India. After 1858, the interests of India were further subordinated to those of Britain. Due to the conflicts of Britain with the other imperialist powers, India was made to serve the British economic interests. Indian resources were also utilized to serve the interests of the British Empire in other parts of the world and in costly wars against other countries. Indian Council Act of 1861. Indian Council Act of 1861 was institutionalized to serve the necessities of cooperation of Indians in the administration of the country. The Act restored the power of the government and the composition of the Governor-General's Council for executive legislative purposes. Indian Council Act of 1861 was institutionalized to serve the necessities of cooperation of Indians in the administration of the country. The Act restored the power of the government and the composition of the Governor-General's Council for executive and legislative purposes. It was the first instance in which the portfolio of Council of Governor-General was incorporated. Features of Act. The 3 separate presidencies, Madras, Bombay, and Bengal, were brought into a common system. System of legislative devolves by this Act. The Act added to the Viceroy's Executive Council a 5th member, a jurist. Viceroy's Executive Council was expanded by the addition of not less than 6 and not more than 12 additional members for the purposes of legislation, who would be nominated by the Governor-General and would hold office for 2 years. Therefore, the total membership increased to 17. Not less than half of these members were to be non-officials. The legislative power was to be restored to the Council of Bombay and Madras, while councils were allowed to be established in other provinces in Bengal in 1862 and North West Frontier Province, NWFP, in 1886, Burma and Punjab in 1897. Canning had introduced the portfolio system in 1859 that divided into several branches, which entrusted to different members of the Governor-General's Council. It also envisages that the member in charge of his department could issue final orders with regard to matters which concerned his department. Lord Canning nominated 3 Indians to his Legislative Council, the Raja of Benares, the Maharaja of Peshawar and Sir Dinka Rao in 1962. Conclusion. The Indian Council Act of 1861 fulfilled the aspiration of associating Indians, provided the defective system of law-making in India and defined the powers of the legislative councils. Hence, in short, the Act laid the foundation of administrative system in India which was lasted till the end of British rule India. Main features of Indian Council Act 1892. The Indian Council Act of 1892 was an act of the Parliament of the United Kingdom that empowered legislative councils in British India by increased their size, which laid the foundation of parliamentary system in India. Before this act, the Indian National Congress put forth with some demand during its session of 1885 to 1889. The major demands placed were as follows. 1. A simultaneous examination of ICS to be held in England and India. 2. Reforms of the Legislative Council and adoption of the principle of election in place of nomination. 3. Opposition to the annexation of Upper Burma. 4. Reduction in the military expenditure. These demands of INC, Indian National Congress, make way for formulation of this Act. List of British Governors-Generals during British period in India. Features of the Act. 1. It increased the number of additional, non-official, members in the central and provincial legislative councils, but maintained the official majority in them. 2. It increased the functions of legislative councils and gave them the power of discussing the budget and addressing questions to the executive. 3. It provided for the nomination of some non-official members of the A. Central Legislative Council by the Viceroy on the recommendation of the Provincial Legislative Councils and the Bengal Chamber of Commerce, and B. That of the Provincial Legislative Councils by the Governors on the recommendation of the district boards, municipalities, universities, trade associations, zamindars, and chambers. The Act made a limited and indirect provision for the use of election in filling up some of the non-official seats both in the central and provincial legislative councils. The word election was, however, not used in the Act. The process was described as nomination made on the recommendation of certain bodies. This Act laid the foundation of parliamentary system in India and also was the landmark in the constitutional development of India. It was the first time the election principles was accepted and introduced by the Act of 1892. Apart from this, the Act fell far short to fulfill national demands and did not give anything substantial. Indian Council Act of 1909 Morley-Minto Reforms, Main Features. Indian Council Act of 1909 Morley-Minto Reforms, Main Features. Morley-Minto Reform was another name of the Indian Council Act of 1909, which was named after the Secretary of State and the Viceroy. It was instituted to placate the moderates. According to this act, the membership of the central and provincial legislative councils was enlarged. However, the number of elected members in these councils was less than half of their total membership. It may also be remembered that the elected members were not elected by the people but by landlords, organizations or traders and industrialists, universities, and local bodies. The British also introduced communal electorates as a part of these reforms. This was meant to create disunity between Hindus and Muslims. Some seats in the councils were reserved for Muslims to be elected by Muslim voters. By this, the British hoped to cut off Muslims from the nationalist movement by treating them apart from the rest of the nation. They told the Muslims that their interests were separate from those of other Indians. To weaken the nationalist movement, the British began to consistently follow a policy of promoting communalism in India. The growth of communalism had serious consequences for the unity of the Indian people and the struggle for freedom. The Congress at its 1909 session welcomed the reforms but strongly opposed the reforms, the creation of separate electorates on the basis of religion. The Morley-Minto reforms did not introduce any significant change in the powers of the councils. They did not mark an advance towards the establishment of a representative government, much less Swaraj. In fact, the Secretary of State frankly declared that he had absolutely no intention of introducing a parliamentary form of government. The autocratic form of government that had been introduced after the revolt of 1857 remained unchanged even after the Morley-Minto reforms. The only change was that the government started appointing some Indians of its choice to certain high positions. Satyendra Prasad Sinha, who later became Lord Sinha, was the first Indian to be made a member of the Governor-General's Executive Council. Later he was made a governor of a province, the only Indian to occupy such a high office during the entire period of British rule. In 1911, he was presented in an imperial darbar that was held at Delhi where British King, George V, and his Queen were also present. The darbar was also attended by Indian princes who displayed their loyalty to the British Crown. Two important announcements were made on the occasion. One was the annulment of the partition of Bengal which had been effected in 1905. The other was the shifting of the capital of British India from Calcutta to Delhi. List of British Governors-Generals during British period in India. Features of the Act. 1. It considerably increased the size of the legislative councils, both central and provincial. The number of members in the Central Legislative Council was raised from 16 to 60. The number of members in the provincial legislative councils was not uniform. 2. It retained an official majority in the Central Legislative Council but allowed the provincial legislative councils to have a non-official majority. 3. It enlarged the deliberative functions of the legislative councils at both levels. For example, members were allowed to ask supplementary questions, move resolutions on the budget, and so on. List of British viceroys during British India. 4. It provided, for the first time, for the association of Indians with the executive councils of the viceroy and governors. Satyendra Prasad Sinha became the first Indian to join the Viceroy's Executive Council. He was appointed as the law member. 5. It introduced a system of communal representation for Muslims by accepting the concept of a separate electorate. Under this, the Muslim members were to be elected only by Muslim voters. Thus, the Act legalized communalism and Lord Minto came to be known as the father of communal electorate. 6. It also provided for the separate representation of presidency corporations, chambers of commerce, universities, and zamindars. Indian Council Act of 1909 AD was instituted to placate the moderates and appeasement to the disseminate Muslims from national movement by granting them separate electorate. Government of India Act 1935, main features. On August 1935, the Government of India passed Longest Act, i.e. Government of India Act 1935 under the British Act of Parliament. This act also included the Government of Burma Act 1935. According to this act, India would become a federation if 50% of Indian states decided to join it. They would then have a large number of representatives in the two houses of the central legislature. However, the provisions with regards to the federation were not implemented. The act made no reference even to granting dominion status, much less independence, to India. With regard to the provinces, the Act of 1935 was an improvement on the existing position. It introduced what is known as provincial autonomy. The ministers of the provincial governments, according to it, were to be responsible to the legislature. the powers of the legislature were increased. However, in certain matters like the police, the government had the authority. The right to vote also remained limited. Only about 14% of the population got the right to vote. The appointment of the Governor-General and governors, of course, remained in the hands of the British government and they were not responsible to the legislatures. The Act never came near the objective that the nationalist movement had been struggling for. List of British Governors-Generals during British period in India. Features of the Act. 1. It provided for the establishment of an all-India federation consisting of provinces and princely states as units. The Act divided the powers between the centre and units in terms of three lists: Federal List, for centre, with 59 items, Provincial List, for provinces, with 54 items, and the Concurrent List, for both, with 36 items. Residuary powers were given to the Viceroy. However, the federation never came into being as the princely states did not join it. 2. It abolished diarchy in the provinces and introduced provincial autonomy in its place. The provinces were allowed to act as autonomous units of administration in their defined spheres. Moreover, the Act introduced responsible governments in provinces, that is, the governor was required to act with the advice of ministers responsible to the provincial legislature. This came into effect in 1937 and was discontinued in 1939. 3. It provided for the adoption of diarchy at the centre. Consequently, the federal subjects were divided into reserved subjects and transferred subjects. However, this provision of the Act did not come into operation at all. 4. It introduced bicameralism in 6 out of 11 provinces. Thus, the legislatures of Bengal, Bombay, Madras, Bihar, Assam and the United Provinces were made bicameral, consisting of a legislative council, upper house, and a legislative assembly, lower house. However, many restrictions were placed on them. 5. It further extended the principle of communal representation by providing separate electorates for depressed classes, scheduled castes, women and labour workers. List of British viceroys during British India. 6. It abolished the Council of India, established by the Government of India Act of 1858. The Secretary of State for India was provided with a team of advisers. 7. It extended franchise. About 10% of the total population got the voting right. 8. It provided for the establishment of a Reserve Bank of India to control the currency and credit of the country. 9. It provided for the establishment of not only a Federal Public Service Commission but also a Provincial Public Service Commission and Joint Public Service Commission for 2 or more provinces. 10. It provided for the establishment of a Federal Court, which was set up in 1937. The main objectivity of the Act of 1935 was that the Government of India was under the British Crown. So, the authorities and their functions derive from the Crown, insofar as the Crown did not itself retain executive functions. His conception, familiar in Dominion constitutions, was absent in earlier acts passed for India. Hence, the Act of 1935 served some useful purposes by the experiment of provincial autonomy. Thus we can say that the Government of India Act 1935 marks a point of no return in the history of constitutional development in India. Government of India Act, 1919 Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms, main features of the Act. During the World War, Britain and her allies had said that they were fighting the war for the freedom of nations. Many Indian leaders believed that after the war was over, India would be given Swaraj. The British government, however, had no intention of conceding the demands of the Indian people. Changes were introduced in the administrative system as a result of the Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms, called the Government of India Act, 1919. Features of the Act. 1. It relaxed the central control over the provinces by demarcating and separating the central and provincial subjects. The central and provincial legislatures were authorized to make laws on their respective list of subjects. However, the structure of government continued to be centralized and unitary. 2. It further divided the provincial subjects into 2 parts, transferred and reserved. The transferred subjects were to be administered by the governor with the aid of ministers responsible to the Legislative Council. The reserved subjects, on the other hand, were to be administered by the governor and his executive council without being responsible to the Legislative Council. This dual scheme of governance was known as diarchy, a term derived from the Greek word diarch, which means double rule. However, this experiment was largely unsuccessful. 3. It introduced, for the first time, bicameralism and direct elections in the country. Thus, the Indian Legislative Council was replaced by a bicameral legislature consisting of an upper house, Council of State, and a lower house, Legislative Assembly. The majority of members of both the houses were chosen by direct election. 4. It required that the 3 of the 6 members of the Viceroy's Executive Council, other than the Commander-in-Chief, were to be Indian. 5. It extended the principle of communal representation by providing separate electorates for Sikhs, Indian Christians, Anglo-Indians, and Europeans. 6. It granted franchise to a limited number of people on the basis of property, tax, or education. 7. It created a new office of the High Commissioner for India in London and transferred to him some of the functions hitherto performed by the Secretary of State for India. 8. It provided for the establishment of a Public Service Commission. Hence, a Central Public Service Commission was set up in 1926 for recruiting civil servants. 9. It separated, for the first time, provincial budgets from the central budget and authorized the provincial legislatures to enact their budgets. 10. It provided for the appointment of a statutory commission to inquire into and report on its working after 10 years of its coming into force. List of British Governors-Generals during British period in India. The changes were nowhere near the Swaraj that the people had hoped to achieve at the end of the war. There was widespread discontent throughout the country. In the midst of this discontent, the government resorted to new measures of repression. In March 1919, the Rowlatt Act was passed, which was based on the report of the Rowlatt Commission. The Assembly had opposed it. Many leaders who were members of the Assembly resigned in protest. Mohammed Ali Jinnah, in his letter of resignation, said that a government that passes or sanctions such a law in times of peace forfeits its claims to be called a civilized government. The passing of this act aroused the indignation of the people. The new measures of repression were condemned as black acts. Gandhi, who had formed a Satyagraha Sabha earlier, called for a countrywide protest. Throughout the country, the 6th of April 1919 was observed as a National Humiliation Day. There were demonstrators and hartals all over the country. All business throughout the country came to a standstill. Such protests of a united people had never been witnessed at any time in India before. The government resorted to brutal measures to put down the agitation, and there were lathi charges and firings at a number of places.